I've looked at hundreds of personal balance sheets, and I see one glaring issue come up time and time again. Turns out it's the single biggest purchase that somebody can make, and it's also the single biggest mistake that I see people make. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about home ownership. Hey everyone, if we haven't met before, my name is Jacob Turner. I'm a former Major League Baseball player, and I'm currently the co-founder of Moment Private Wealth. In today's video, we're going to talk about home ownership. We're going to talk about the mistakes that I see people make. We're going to talk about how you should think about budgeting for a house, the hidden costs that come with it, the mortgage nuances that you should know. And by the end of this video, what I can promise you is that you're going to be educated on, if you're going out to make that home purchase, how much you should buy, the costs involved with it, and everything that goes into it. So you make sure you're not on the flip side saying, I think I bought too much house. Before we dive in, I want to give you some context about the numbers we're going to be talking about today. And I always like to give you guys a case study so then we can better understand and be able to apply these specific numbers. Now, one point I want to make is these numbers might not apply to you, but you can use these numbers, you can bake out the percentages, and you can apply them to your life. So in the scenario we're going to talk about today, the family earns a combined income of $500,000. Now, again, that doesn't mean that you have to earn $500,000 to get a ton out of this video. You're going to be able to backtrack a lot of the information that we talked about and make it specific to your situation. Let's talk about the most common advice that I see online. And what you guys are looking at here is this is an online calculator that anybody can use. It's from Bankrate. And what we're looking at here is we're saying, hey, if we had our annual gross income of $500,000, we had a down payment on a house of $250,000, we had an interest rate of 6.5%, and we had a loan term of 30 years. What would they recommend that we could spend on a house? And they're recommending that you could spend about $2.1 million on the purchase price of the home. That means your monthly payment would be about $11,667. So where are they getting these numbers? They're surely not coming out of thin air. And it comes down to a basic principle that a lot of people talk about with home ownership. They say that 28% of your gross take home can go towards home ownership costs. So in this scenario, $11,667 is about 28% of our monthly take home of our $500,000 annual salary. So you're thinking, okay, well, if that's what we should do, then why don't we do that? Well, here's where the big mistake comes into play. When we're looking at these numbers, the only thing that this calculator is showing is it is showing just your interest rate on your mortgage and your principal payment. It's not talking about any of the other costs that are involved with home ownership. So let's talk about what some of those look like. We always think about the main expense, our mortgage expense, but that's really only one of what I consider 6 major cost centers when it comes to owning a home. So the first one we have is our mortgage expense. The next one that I think about is property taxes. So these are going to be the taxes that we owe for owning the property that we have. The third one is homeowners insurance. Homeowners insurance has been on the rise recently. It's going to cost more and more money to insure the house that you own. The next thing is utilities. This is pretty common, pretty basic. This is going to be things like heating, cooling, internet, cable, things to actually live in the home that you have. The next big thing to think about is going to be potentially HOA fees. Now, this is going to vary depending on the subdivision and where you're at, but this is certainly something you should be factoring into your overall costs. And the last cost is everybody knows about it. Everybody knows it's on the horizon, but people don't actually budget for it and think about it when they're buying a house. And this is the one that I think gets people in the most amount of trouble. It's ongoing maintenance. When I say ongoing maintenance, think about it. If the roof has a leak, if the gutters break, if you need new siding, if the driveway needs fixed, if you need to mulch the yard, all these things come with maintaining potentially the biggest purchase of your life. And we need to be budgeting for it. To recap where we're at, we've talked about the fact that the framework says 28% of our gross take home we can spend on housing costs. But we already looked up, when we look at a typical online calculator, we're not factoring in these other 5 costs that we talked about. We're only talking about the mortgage expense. So let's do another scenario. The same $500,000 of income, but let's talk about what we actually could afford with this. Instead of our initial $2.1 million purchase that our initial calculator said that we could afford, that was 28% of our $500,000 of yearly income, let's take a look at a scenario if we were buying $1 million house. So what we have here is we're buying $1 million house. Our down payment is 20%, which you can see here. Our loan term is 30 years. Our interest rate is 6.5%, which is pretty competitive in the current environment. And what you're going to see here is our monthly breakdown is, now in this scenario, we're not going to put anything in for property taxes and homeowners insurance. We're going to show that here in a second. But what I want you to see here is just our initial mortgage payment, okay? One of 6 cost centers that goes into potentially owning a property is going to be $5,000. Now, we talked a little bit at the beginning of this video about the nuances that come with a mortgage. I think one of the biggest misconceptions I see people make is, well, a mortgage is this forced savings tool where every month when I'm putting away this money, in this scenario, $5,000, it's a way for me to save and build equity in our house. Now, that's not entirely untrue, But let's look at what's called the amortization schedule, or how much is actually going towards our equity or our principal payment and how much is actually just going towards interest of our debt. So if we take a look here, this is one of the most interesting things I think for people to look at is if we had this loan and we played it out, so it was an $800,000 loan, we put down 20% on our $1 million property, you can see our initial payment is about $723 is going towards our principal or building equity, and $4,300 is going towards our interest. So you can see more than 80% of our $5,000 monthly payment is going towards interest. And in fact, if we go a step further, if we scroll all the way down to this is the first time that more than 50% of our $5,000 monthly payment is going to go towards our principal as opposed to our interest. I think this is a really important nuance for folks to understand when it comes to mortgages. Yes, you are putting in $5,000 a month. No, you are not saving or putting equity of $5,000 a month into your house. The vast majority of that $5,000 payment for your mortgage is going to go towards interest, not principal. So the next thing we're going to look at is we're going to take a look at these other 5 cost centers that are involved. We bought this $1 million house. What would these other cost centers look like? And we're going to get really specific in terms of how would I think about budgeting for these to make sure that by the end, you guys have a very clear vision on if I was buying a property, how much can I actually spend and feel confident and comfortable with it? What we're looking at here is the yearly costs of those 6 cost centers. And let's break them down one by one to understand how I got to these numbers. The first one we have on here is property taxes. So again, we're buying $1 million home, and typically what I like to budget in for property taxes is about 1.5% of that purchase price. Now, I want you to understand a couple things about property taxes. They are highly dependent on the state that you're in. So depending on where you're buying at, the property taxes are going to vary. Places like Texas have very high property taxes. Places like Missouri, where I'm at, are very much in the middle ground. But there's other states that are quite a bit lower than that. So you need to make sure you understand what do the property taxes potentially look like on the house I'm going to. The next thing I put in here was maintenance costs. And when I think about maintenance costs, the way I come up with this $20,000 number is I like to budget in 2% of the cost of the home. Now look, if you look online, they'll often say, oh, budget in 1%. And I do think on an ongoing basis, 1% is usually about right. But what I've found is if you're going to live in the house for a long time, if you start budgeting in 2%, it's going to give you money to spend on the minor upkeep things, but it's also going to be giving you money to potentially put away for the bigger things that are coming down the line. You got to replace windows, you got to replace siding, the driveway needs to be replaced. These things can be big, big expenses. So I like to have a little bit of extra money in there from a maintenance perspective. The next thing we have on here is homeowners insurance. Now, homeowners insurance, typical rates that we're seeing, again, this is very dependent on where your property is. If you're on the beach in Florida, these could be 5 or 10 times the cost. But typical rates that we're seeing are going to be around $5,000 per every $1 million of coverage. So if our house is $1 million, we budget in $5,000 per year for the cost of our homeowners insurance. The next thing we have on here is HOA fees. We just put this as a flat $1,000. Again, this is going to be very highly dependent on the neighborhood you're in, whether it's a condo, whether it's a house, all these other factors. But I think for this scenario, we put in $1,000. That's a reasonable. The next one we have on here is utilities. Again, we put this as a reasonable number of $1,000 a month. Now, some people could say, whoa, that's super high. I spend way less than that. Some people might say, that's really low. I'm spending way more than that. Again, this is highly dependent on the house, depending on a bunch of other factors, but I think it's important to start thinking about what would you budget into the utility bucket. And then the last thing we have on here is our mortgage. So our mortgage was a little over $5,000 a month. That means we're paying about $60,000 a year in mortgage costs. So what are the key factors to look at here? Well, our total monthly costs of this house, $1 million property, is $9,416 per month. Now, what's really interesting about this is only about 50% of that, about a little over $5,000, is the mortgage itself. The other 50-ish percent is the other 5 cost centers that we talked about. So when we start thinking about budgeting for potentially buying a house, we have to understand that 5 of our 6 cost centers are going to make up 40 to 50%, and our mortgage might make up the other 50 to 60%. So our total yearly costs on this property are $113,684. Or if we go back to our initial scenario where we said we want to have 28% of our gross housing costs being our absolute top of our spend, this is about 23% on a $1 million house. Now remember, our initial calculator said that we could buy a $2.1 million property. And now we're saying on a $1 million property, we're already at 23% of our total housing costs. Now, I think this is really important to understand because this is where The other thing to think about here that we already talked about on that amortization schedule is of the $113,000 that you put in, only $8,174 of that went towards equity of the house in the first year. Okay. That's the principal that went from the mortgage payment that you made. The $105,000 of additional costs, that's just gone. Okay. That's money that it costs to maintain the property, keep up with the loan, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where I think people go wrong. They think that all this money that we're putting into a house, it's the American dream. You're building all this equity. You're building all this value in the future. And it's true. You are building wealth by owning a home. Now, I'm going to argue and say that, is that the most efficient way to build wealth? Probably not. Your primary home, I often don't look at it as an investment. I look at it as a place to live. And it's an okay place to be able to spend money. But I think this is where people fall into the trap. They think all this money that I'm spending on this house, I'm going to be able to get back because it's the American dream. I'm owning this home. I'm going to build all this wealth. We've looked at a ton of numbers today. We've talked through a couple different scenarios. We talked through our initial scenario that had us spending $2 million all the way down to the scenario of us spending $1 million on the house. What do I want the takeaway for us to be with this? The takeaway I want is for you to understand that when you're buying a house, this is going to be the biggest purchase of your life. You don't want to be doing this a million different times. Okay. You want to get this right on the upfront. And again, let's go back to what I said at the beginning. The biggest mistake that I see people make when it comes to building long-term wealth is buying too much house. And the reason for that's pretty simple, because they're only thinking about the one cost center. They're thinking about their mortgage. They're not thinking about the other 5 cost centers that are involved with potentially owning a property. So if you're out there and you're looking at buying a house, make sure you run the numbers. Make sure you understand what percentage of my gross income do I want to spend on my housing costs? And then backtrack to say, what would my housing costs look like if I bought this property? When you go talk to a lender, when you go talk to a real estate agent, all they're going to talk about is the purchase price of the property and what your mortgage is going to be. But you're going to be smart and you're going to say, hey, I know there's 5 other cost centers that are involved with potentially owning this home. And if you can map out what those are, you're going to be confident, you're going to be comfortable, and you're not going to make that big mistake. The goal of this channel is to help you get smarter with your money. So if you're into that sort of thing, make sure you like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you on a future video.